So let it be written. So let it be done. This is Tabletop Terrors. And today we're going to do one of the videos in a series. We call it Beyond the Rules, which is basically all three of us are game designers. And so sometimes we like to talk theory. And one of the things we're going to do today is we're going to address one of the biggest, I think, problems that I see in game design that people don't realize they're having. And if you don't realize you're having this problem, it can stop you from designing or make you hate what you design. And it's a very basic principle, which is I see so many people start writing rules, but they have not chosen what their goal is. And it is almost literally like saying, well, I feel like I'm going to go somewhere, and you just get in your car and take a trip. Like, where do you end up, and where? It's really important to figure out what you're trying to do, because then you are equipped to do it the best way and consider the feel. So what made me think this specific thing was, Jeff, you brought up something that was right under my nose, and I had never realized it until the way you positioned it. So tell me a little bit about this epiphany that you had.
Yeah, so it's basically the idea that like how often the rules come up in your game is basically proportionate to how elegant those rules need to be in order for it to be continually fun in the game. And the way that I'll kind of try to frame this is like there's a lot of people who like to look at like, especially when it comes to rules like anything about realism or things like that, where it's like, okay, I want my setting to have survival rules, so you're going to need to hunt for food and things like that. So they start to like, okay, so I want mechanics that'll enforce that feeling, so I'm going to make some like foraging mechanics. So they come up with all these rules, and then they end up making this huge, big system of like, okay, so first you need to roll on this table to see if there's any food in the area, and then you can make a check, and if you pass the check, then you have these options, and then you can pick one of these different things, and it'll like to make this huge, big, like, webbing system without necessarily thinking about, like, how that often that's going to come up and play. Whereas, like, if it's a survival game, you're going to need to look for food every day, which might be once per session, might be multiple times per session. And if every time you have to look for food, it's this huge, big, complicated process, that's going to take, like, 20, 30 minutes of your session time every time to constantly do these rules that, like, which can be interesting, if you do them once or twice. But when you're doing that same, huge big thing every single time, it starts to become, it remains equally as tedious and like much less fulfilling each time that you have to do it over and over again. And it can be a huge trap, I think, for designers where they want to make these big systems that have variance and options and crunch and all these different things, and that can be really cool for like one-time big moments that you have to like finish out. But if it's something that you're doing constantly throughout the game, that's when you really need like elegant mechanics to be able to take that through. So if you look at like most RPG systems, the very basic resolution is almost always very, very simple. In D&D, you roll a d20, you add your modifier. That's the entire thing, and it's like that for a lot of systems where it's just you roll one or two dice, maybe up to 5 or 6, at the very most, and then you have an answer. But if you have basically the more steps than that, then it starts to get very, very tedious if you're doing that every single time. So when you're basically designing a system, you have to look at how many times is this going to happen, and how many times is it going to stay fun. And if the answer is that it's going to stop being fun, after a couple times, then you've made it too much. You need to slim it down, basically, is the general idea.
Games or systems like that, Jeff, you pointed out one of the biggest pitfalls, which is a designer starts out by saying, I want my game to have this. And I think that's a really big mistake because, similar to what Tim said, to me, a rule is anything that allows the player to interact with the game world. Anything else is narrative. So if I can go and say, I grab the thing off the shelf, if I don't roll for it, if there's no thing that makes my guy grab the thing off the shelf, it's narrative. You grab the thing off the shelf. So what you should do instead is, like you said, Jeff, you should not only decide what you want your players to do. I want my players to be able to forage for various ingredients, right? Immediately upon saying it, it's different. because I'm going, oh no, I'm now crafting the player's experience rather than the concept of, well, I want a complicated foraging system. I've written a cool algorithm to figure out with this many things, spending this many days, how many comes out. That's not a rule. It's effectively an algorithm. It's a function. You put an input in and something comes out, and your players aren't a part of it. Obviously, you can put the players a part of it, but if they're just putting the input in, well, they're not playing the game. So that exact concept, where if you start with what the players can do in the world and only craft things that are actually rules and not necessarily just sort of ephemeral systems that they don't necessarily get to touch, between that and making sure that those things that are the whole thrust of the game are elegant because they're going to happen a lot, you've solved 90% of game design problems. Really, you won't run into so many of the issues if you do those two things. There are still problems. There's still things will change. There's a million, things that come into game design, but you can get a playable game by just doing those things and coming up with a few concepts like that.
Yeah. So, and that's a very, very good point, which is, if the players are just the ones who are feeding the machine and they don't really have any fun thing to do, that's not really a choice. Like you're saying, that's not really something that affects the way that they interact with the world. You're just like, here, put this in the machine. And that's kind of what I want to talk about, which is, if you do clearly define your goal, often you'll find that, James, as you say, the goal is, I want a survival system in my game that is not necessarily a cleanly defined goal. So why? So what I'll ask myself is, the way that I try to do goals is, I want to do X so that, and that second step of kind of like asking why you want to do it can often help you jump to the best way to do it, or if you even need a way to do it. So when we were writing A Dead Man's Guide to Dragongrin, I did want there to be survival elements. So, and I worked with Jeff on this, and one of the things I decided to do, and we've talked about this in prior videos, it's fun sometimes for the players to be low on food. Okay, so we agreed, at least in some of the games we play, or low on ammo, or have something like a weapon break and those kind of things. So the first design inclination is to design a system in which these things occur. Rules that govern when and how a weapon breaks. And so instead, we actually were like, well, you know what? What's the shortest way to get to that? And we invented something called narrative conditions. And so rather than inventing a whole system to track being low on food, and of course, this whole conversation is caveated with, of course, agree on the kind of game you're going to play with your players. And there's a huge disclaimer about that. But specifically, there is just a condition that you can grant that is called low ammo. It's actually called low supply. And you can roll a D4 that essentially is food, water, ammo, and money. Because what I want is to have the players low on money, not an economy system where they have to govern where their money is. The fun part for me is, oh, you're low on ammo. So instead of building a machine that makes that happen with a bunch of bookkeeping, it was easier to just say, here, boink, you're now low on ammo. We jumped right to the finish line. And Jeff, like you said, I don't have to do all these crazy things in between. So even if I did it often, it's as simple as, you're low on food again. Oh, what are we going to do? Or, that kind of thing. So I just wanted to say, don't feel like you need to build a system every time you want a thing to happen. You can just make a thing happen.
Yeah, and that sort of mentality is like exactly what I was talking about too, of like the speed from which you get to the desired effect. For that is so small, and that's like so important, I think, when it comes to these sorts of things, is like you say, the thought of like, it would be cool if they were low on ammo. 2, they are low on ammo, and we're seeing the effects of that in the game. For that system is 3 seconds to say, you have this is what it means, continue, and it's that fast. And I think that when it comes to these sorts of systems, that part is the important part, because I think most people are going to be totally fine with like, okay, yeah, sometimes we'll be low on ammo, sometimes we'll be low on food. That's cool, and we can do things to mitigate that if we want to. But where it can be frustrating is then like, what do you do about that? And if the answer is you have to spend half the session making all these checks to then look for ammo or to look for food, like where it has ground the game down to a halt, like that's I think where a lot of people start to fall back on these systems. Or like another big thing is like bookkeeping and math, where it's like, if I have to sit there and like track all these different ammo ratios and I'm going to spend this much money to get this much ammo, which should last me this amount of, and it's all this bookkeeping, where it's like that sort of thing can be a huge pain. Now, if you like that sort of thing, there's plenty of ways to do that. But for me, it's always a hindrance. And I'll call back on, I've talked about this system plenty of times before, and I will talk about it plenty more times, but like Spire is one of my favorite RPGs. One of the things I like about it is there's almost no math, almost no bookkeeping, and the resolution is like lightning fast. You roll up to 3d10s, you take the highest number, and then you reference that as the result for everything in the game. So if you need to get to any resolution of like, can I do this? Does this happen? It's just, you make a roll, and there's the answer. You know, there's no math, there's no bookkeeping, there's no, crazy systems. It's just, so I think that speed is very important when it comes to ammo, when it comes to food, the things that are going to happen a lot in the game, to just be able to say, you have it, it's there, and then, that changes the way that you play now. That getting from point A to point B within a matter of seconds, rather than in a matter of minutes, or God forbid, more than that, can make all the difference in like, oh yeah, this is fun, versus like, oh, this again.
Yeah, and real quick, I was just going to say something specific to the narrative system, to the rules I brought up, because I know I talked a lot, but I think this goes right with what Jeff is saying. The other thing that was really important to us with those rules is that the way that you resolve them is also open-ended and narrative. So that, Jeff, as you say, it's not okay, because if you have this wide open, like really neat way, and it's this quick, oh, you are now low on ammo, and then you require the same resolution every time, you'll catch yourself in the same loop on the wrong end, just in a different way where,
yep.
Oh, now we have to go find a shop. So that's not what it is. The players can say, oh, can we search the battlefield for any arrows that might be sticking, in the trees and all that? Perfect. So, yeah, anyway, I just wanted to mention that as well, that the resolution itself also being flexible and open, like you mentioned in Spire, it goes a long way to being elegant, because then you don't have to write 20 rules about how to find ammo. You write one general elegant rule that covers all the ways.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the coolest parts about game design. So what Jeff said at the beginning was, it's the complexity, or the amount of time it takes to resolve a rule should effectively be proportional to how often it's used. It should be faster if it's used more often. Furthermore, if something is used a lot and does take long, any amount of time, right? That value is to some degree should be proportional in a way to the outcome, right? So if you do a lot of stuff to say, I picked one flower, well, that's a mistake. But if there's this really big, long thing, especially if the players enjoy it, where they're foraging, and for some, that's the game, that's this phase of the game, it's okay to have a foraging system, but you have to make sure the players are enjoying it, right? It's those multiple things where I'm like, you're allowed to have complicated systems, they just have to be good, complicated systems. Which then leads into the second part, which is you can always make a complicated system more intuitive. One of my favorite examples is Scythe, the board game. Doesn't have complicated rules necessarily, but the way you move the pieces around is so intuitive to make it clear which things you've unlocked and which things you haven't. It's not a part of the game. It's technically a part of the board design, but they've taken something that other games make more difficult. They give you a little reference card of what things, and they've taken information that's often derived. You have to look here to see what mine is, and made it immediately able to be looked at to go, oh, well, my block's there, so I'm there. The rule didn't get any simpler, but the implementation of the rule was so much more intuitive. And that separately, because those rules aren't necessarily complicated, separately though, it elevated the game much higher, right? So there's a few knobs to tweak. It's not necessarily just, less complex, because sometimes there's too much abstraction, right? But yeah, so to some degree, it's just there's a little more leeway within creating rules to turn some of the dials, because every once in a while you can do a clever trick to make it happen faster for a person so that you can use it more often. If that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think something that goes alongside with that is like the answer to what I'm saying is not that you cannot have complex systems, is that if you're going to, it needs to be fun. And there are a lot of complex systems that are not fun or fast. And I think that's where I think you run into the problems. It's like, it's okay if you have something that takes a little bit of work to get to, but the result needs to be impactful to the game, and it needs to be exciting to reach that point. And like, it needs to basically matter that you've used that time to do that. So like an easy example that I can use is like in like even D&D 5e games. Like I love using brutal injury charts. Like if you get a crit, you get some crazy injury effect. You know, that'll happen to you. That takes a lot of time. You have to like roll the dice. You have to look on the table. You have to apply it and tell them what it means and all these things. But the result of that is like extremely dramatic and visceral. Where it's like when you see like, okay, that guy broke your hand and now your hand is useless until you get it fixed. Like that's so like immediately impactful to your character that the fact that it took a couple minutes to get to that point is then justified by that result of like, wow, that completely changes everything. So yeah, I'm totally with you that it's okay to have more complicated systems as long as, like you say, it's intuitive and also that time is well spent. You know, like you say, if you spend all that time and the result is just that you have more rations on your ration list, and that's what took 5 minutes to get to, versus it took 5 minutes for me to find out that I killed this guy and took this injury. Like that, for me, those are two very different things, even if the time frame and complexity might be the very same.
Yeah, and for example, there's a cool thing you can do where if you take things that are fast and fun, like brutal injury charts, and make it faster and keep the same amount of fun, say an app where you press a button and it rolls for you, it happens instantly. Not only will you always use them, you can spend a little more time on the other systems that need a little more love, because the brutal injury thing takes no time.
Yeah, and I think another cool thing to really keep in mind as a designer is if you make a rule for everything, then you can quickly find yourself where you have disproportionate weight on certain events. And so, Jeff, the example that you used when you were kind of first bringing up the whole concept you mentioned was there is the opposite end of the spectrum where it is actually fun. And you just used another example where the amount of time you spend and the little like subsystem or whatever you want to call it, the way you execute the rules to find out that brutal injury is worth it because the outcome should feel like it's worth the time. You know, that's important enough. Another great example you used was the fireball spell in 5th edition, where you roll a ton of dice and then you count them up, but it's really fun to see how much damage you did the number of times you can do fireball a day. You know, like, but when you start making it so that your combat system is this counter roll where I roll all these dice and it's a dice pool, and it's what happens when you make all the rules that big. Number one, fireball feels way less special because it's the same thing I use to find food. And then number two, as Jeff, as you mentioned, it becomes so tedious that it's not worth the output. So just kind of give you advice, you know, on game design the other way, if you're listening to this, you can make something a little more, not necessarily complex, but we'll call it involved on purpose if it's a flagship thing that only happens every once in a while and you want it to feel different and big and special. But if everything's like that, nothing will feel that way.
Yeah, can you imagine playing 5e where every single attack roll you make, you had to roll like 10 dice and count them all up? Like how old that would get so quick. And that's the way that it can be tempting to design systems that go in your game sometimes. And it's just like it's just not the way to do it. Like, yeah, that needs to be the special moment for the big thing, you know? And I think what you said was also really important is like, you should design those rules to reinforce the big moments in your narrative, like the way that you want your rules to basically play out a story. The mechanics basically dictate what's important to the game and what's, sidelined to the game. So you can basically pick those big complexity moments to tie in with your big narrative asks that you want to make of the world, and basically make those one and the same, and it makes them feel way more special. Where, like you say, if everything was Fireball, where you're just rolling 8d6 every single time, it's like, okay, can we just turn all of the numbers down and just make this way faster?
Yeah, it's funny because what you guys are describing, especially the concept of if a system takes too long to resolve, it isn't fun enough, nobody will play it, right? If we zoom out far enough, that describes any RPG that you're not a big fan of. Well, no, that system does not do the thing I want it to do well enough for me to spend my time playing it. The thing is, your game is made up of a bunch of little systems that if people aren't showing up for, it's not nobody's playing it. You know what I mean? Like, so plenty of games have been designed. Like, let's talk about, not for a long time, but Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. It's sort of famous for charts and all these things you have to look up and stuff. It was in concept a very, one of the first games of its type. And in that way is miraculous, but in another sense is the least intuitive, most unhelpful way potentially that you could lay out a game, to that exists. Now, obviously, that's not their fault. You do the first one, it's not going to look that great. But that's what's interesting. Some people love that system. Now, some of that may be nostalgia, but the idea is, again, technically for them, that system is a system that does what they want it to do well enough that it's worth their time to spend in it. Even if you're looking up how far you can swim on a chart for your, race, that's also your class. Like, that's it. Yeah. So it doesn't matter how complex it is as long as people play it, but more people will play it if it's not too complex or overly, unnecessarily. I can think of a lot of words that fit there.
Yeah. And something else to kind of like, and this is going to assume that, this is a whole can of worms, but it's something that is worth mentioning, which is I am often surprised. I'm very surprised at the number of rules that come out by indie game designers or, I don't want to say like amateur game designers, but, just game designers who don't play test. And in every single case, in every case I've ever been someone who has put out a design for a playtest, I have always been very, pleasantly surprised by how immediately it reveals what needs work and what is solid. But also handing it to other people, I'm always like, oh my gosh, I didn't even think of that when they ask questions. And so that's a whole nother episode, getting playtesters, starting a playtest, doing that kind of thing. But because that can be challenging, I put my stuff out there, nobody plays it. And that's a whole other thing. But that is so important. And iterative playtesting over time is how you get something to feel just right and to really fine tune it. And without that, you're kind of just guessing.
Yeah, I think it can very quickly, these, like you say, these things can become very, very apparent very fast once you sort of put them out into the world. And sometimes it might even be you might even be the person who immediately realizes, like, oh wait, no, this isn't fun. Like, I've definitely had that moment where it's like I have a game ready and I'll go to run the game, and it's not even like I think this is great and everyone else is like, oh well, actually maybe this could use some work. It's like I'll ask them to do the thing that I wrote and then be like, oh wow, this is terrible. Yeah, this is not how this needs to be. Like, so you can kind of have this vision of it in your head of like how it's going to play out. That's like this perfect thing, and then suddenly, you actually see it play out, and they're like, oh wait, so I have to do what first? And then so I have to roll here, and then I also have to do this, and then I have to check this table across this. It's just like, okay, no, actually, yeah, this isn't great. I should take this back to the drawing board, slim it down, you change it however it needs to be. But yeah, it can become something that I'll even like do when I'll, make little systems, is I'll just sit there and it's like, I'm just going to roll this system 5 times in a row. And it's like, by the 5th time, you can usually tell like, this is getting annoying or like, oh, this is still fun. And like, even just those little tests on your own by yourself in your room can sometimes be the thing of like, the first time was kind of cool, and now I'm sick of this already. It's probably not a good sign that you should keep it as it is in the book, because it'll get annoying in the game too.
And earlier when, we talked about how what's called behavior-driven design, what Tim touched on, and what I'm going to talk about is by doing it from the position of what the player can do, you can often avoid a lot of the common pitfalls with the first time you sit down, the game doesn't even make sense. Because if you do it from the player's perspective, that's where you get. Obviously, there's no replacement for playtesting, good playtesting, and like you said, Tim, iterations. That's the thing. Make something and have somebody play it and go, okay, make one thing better. You've iterated. It's better now. If you do that enough, you have a game. It might take you 10 years, but that's not important. The thing is, iterating well with things like behavior-driven design and other concepts, that we're talking about here, not just making things up just because. They won't all fit together. But that is probably the most important thing. It's so interesting how many concepts of programming, I'm a programmer at my day job, come into game design because it's iterative. You have to discuss with a lot of people, what things they expect to happen when a user goes to the site. And the rules are so concrete and I have to make them. I'm effectively designing a game where somebody goes and inputs a PDF. The thing is, it's not fun. That's the only thing that makes it not a game, right? But the idea is, so many games people don't iterate on, for example. Even that. They go, oh, I made this thing, and why is nobody playing my game? Well, you released it. That's a good first step. You never made it any better. People said, oh, that's cool, but what else? Well, nothing. Okay, you know what I mean? Like, people are only going to play your game if your game is fun, and your game's likely not to be fun the first time you make it.
Yeah. The other thing, too, and, again, assuming you can get people to look at it, one of the major things that first version of a playtest will do is prove if the idea you had in your head is clear enough to someone who has no idea what they're looking at. Very often when I release, a first playtest, I will realize that there are a lot of things that I assumed or didn't explain clearly enough. There was one, we did several rounds of playtesting for A Dead Man's Guide to Dragongrain, especially with the class stuff. And there was wording in the Circle of the Grin Druid where essentially the way an ability was worded, just to try to make it work, actually made it so that if they go to sleep, the ability stops working. It was weird, but it was like this thing, and like a couple people caught it where they're like, hey, if we take a short or a long rest, this cool thing that's supposed to happen that we can't do. And I don't remember exactly what it was, but I remember just the way that we worded it. We had to change that wording just a little bit, and then it was fine. But it was this weird loop where the player literally wouldn't be able to sleep, or they'd lose this 24-hour-a-day ability or something. It was just, that's the kind of stuff you would never catch, because you know what you mean.
Exactly.
Yeah, and that's the great barrier of design that we all must overcome, is it's so easy to think that so we have in our minds the sort of sum total of the experience that's very innate to our own understanding, but the rules that we write do not always communicate that entirety. And there's sometimes, I think, a lot of baggage that gets accidentally left behind, where to you all these dots connect, but then you give it to them and it's just a bunch of dots, and it's you have to find a way to bridge that gap of oh, the rules are like this because they want to facilitate this sort of thing, and that's why it's like this. That is not always very obvious, and to use a system to the best that it can be done, you kind of not only have to know what the letter of the rules say, but you also have to at least have a sense of what are they trying to get to happen as a result of these rules. What's their ideal experience that's going to come and be derived from this rule set and actually happen at the table. And if the way that you're writing your systems isn't communicating that part of it, then I think that can sometimes lead to the systems being very misused. Of oh no, I put all these things together because it was just a cool way to narratively prep this thing that the GM can use if they want to. But then everyone's seeing them, and it's they think that they have to roll them real time in the game, and it's that's not necessarily what I meant. And it's those sorts of things can very quickly be, I think, like lost in translation, where it's like, oh no, that's not, you know, that's not what I was trying to do with this, and people are now using it wrong as a result. And I think that can sometimes be just as big an issue as like the literal rules not working right, is people not understanding what the system is trying to do and like when and why to use it as it's written.
And especially now that we're talking about this more, again, this is the whole thrust of designing by behavior. The reason is if you do it perfectly, right? So you're supposed to do this with programs and it's a whole thing, and we don't have to get into that. But the idea is if you were to document your game in this way, right? You have the rules, and then you have all the things players and anybody else can do. A common exercise that you do as a web developer or somebody that makes software that has to write technical specs is to write the instructions of how to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. Because this is exactly what you said, Jeff. So many things are assumed. Well, you assume you know how to use a knife, but you need to write it as though they've never seen it implement a spread. If you're really doing it right and you're a programmer, it doesn't have to be a knife. It can be what they call an interface. But the idea is it could be a knife, it could be an offset spatula, it could be a fork. But
Spoon.
you need something, right? So now you're slotting in different things, but by kind of giving yourself a meta view of it, right? If you list these behaviors, similar to the way Tim said, given the player does this, then this, when this, you can look at the circle of the druid and somebody can look at the rule that was written and go, hey, the actual text of the rule doesn't match what you said. You said you wanted this, but in the rule it says if they go to sleep, so I'm going to fix that. It actually cuts out the middle part where you're going, hey, is this right? You're going, no, I can look at the tech spec of exactly what it is. You would never release these behaviors because they would be, they're a reference for the people creating the game. Like they wouldn't be helpful for anybody else, but they're so helpful to go, nope, that's not in there. Or if you said, oh, can players hit people with a sword? Well, let me check the behavior. No, we didn't write the hit people with a sword yet. Oh, well, I gave the druid this thing where they have a sword. I'm like, well, no, if it's not in the behaviors, it doesn't count. You know what I mean? You can so easily quantify every single thing that can happen in your game, which allows you to just not have to worry about people doing things, game-breaking things that otherwise they wouldn't be able to do.
Yeah, and so I'll tell you a funny story about that exact thing, about hitting people with a sword and not realize it. I'll tell you that story. But first, the other thing too, like, is that I don't know where and how, but some games thought that if they write it like a technical manual, in terms of the language being like dense, and I don't know, I love 5e, but their language sometimes, it's so strange to me why they chose to sound the way that they sound. And so one of the things we really set out to do, and we do this in all the Absolute Tabletop products we work on, we absolutely make it clear with addendums and explicitly say things. Because, Jeff, you're so right where, if you don't say it and you assume it, there are so many people who are going to use the rule wrong, and that's your fault. So, like, we have paragraphs sometimes that will say, this rule is intended to evoke this. The game master should feel free to do X and Y and work with the players to achieve Z. Like, very clearly saying how a rule should be used, or at least how we wrote it to be used. So anyway, it's just, that's two things. One, watch your language, and if you can make it so that it's just clear, great. And then second, don't be afraid to tell people your design goal in writing the rule. Because then, if they know, James, like you say, if they know, and this is kind of a version where it goes in the final product, it's like you're giving them the public-facing part of the tech spec that's most important. So now if a GM comes across this rule, they're like, oh, I see what they're trying to do with this rule. So for my game, all I need to do is this. And that is just not present in a lot of RPGs, is like how this rule is intended to be used, and that would clear up so much. So there's a ton of that in a Dead Man's Guide where we say, like, there's whole sections that say, this is what, like, the Dominion of Ash, these are the parts, this paragraph and these tables are meant to be used this way, and, use it like this. Because without that, there's just so many things that can be missed.
It's a bucket of worms I'm reserving, but it's labeled, there's no such thing as rules as written, only the spirit of the rule. I could rewrite D&D 5th edition without changing a single rule in my opinion, a way that's easier to teach it.
Yeah.
The rules do not make the game. The explanation, of the rules do not make the game. So you're absolutely right. I'm like, No, you need to give them as much as you can about the rule. They should know the spirit of it and be able to deduce it, not worry about dense wording to say, well, no, it says may.
Mm-hmm.
Like in Magic, I understand that there are very specific circumstances for like, but in RPG, it's like, no. We're trying to make it so that your players feel like this. If your players don't feel like this, the rules not work.
Yeah, I think it's a whole nother trap, so we don't have to get too deep into these weeds because it's a full field of them. But I think that there's also like a whole subset of like, especially when it comes to 5e, where it's so like ubiquitous and public facing to like newcomers and like, you know, people who aren't super into the culture of it. So I get why they have to do it for 5e, but I hate it. Of just like, they have to write the rules in a way that you basically have to assume that the person using the rules is going to try to abuse them to their advantage. So you have to mitigate all possibility of it in the technical wording of the rules, which is, I think, where so much of their issues comes up. It's just like, it's like, it's a running joke across some of us that like do 5e stuff of like, it's so much faster to write abilities in other systems because you can cut the crap. Like if you have an ability that just says like, when an enemy hits you, you can hit them back. It's like in 5e it has to be when an enemy uses their attack action to use an attack against you, you may use a reaction to. And it's just like you have to like add so many caveats and so many slashes and so many exclamation points to like make sure that it spells out an unabusable, like a completely like airtight version of it, which can like limit how you can like portray the rules. Like, it'd be so much nicer if you could just say, when they hit you, you hit them back, as long as it makes sense. And like, there are systems that just leave it like that, you know, and it's totally okay to do that. 5e doesn't do that. I think that like also comes into all this is just like, it comes down to the spirit of the rule thing too, and why it's so important to say the intent of the rules. Is if you just say, when an enemy hits you, you hit them back within reason. Here's what we're trying to do with that. That cuts out all those corner cases, all those abuse scenarios where it's like, oh, well, technically this, within the rules that. And it's just like, you don't actually need all that explanation and fluff if you can portray the intent of the rules. I think that's definitely a place that 5e falls short, is that they just, instead of trying to explain any of their reasoning for the rules, they just have to like make the rules completely literally airtight, and it makes it so much denser in a bad way than it needs to be. It's like you can just assume that people are going to act in good faith if you tell them to, and if they don't, then that's their fault for playing the game poorly, you know, and making it, you know, and going out of their way to try to break something that's not meant to be broken.
Can I show you the most clear example of this in any 5e thing I've ever seen? Okay. Mm-hmm. Now, to be fair, this is in an Unearthed Arcana, so it is a playtest. But to me, this is just an example of, Jeff, as you say, what this thing has to try to achieve something. It has to literally build in every caveat of all the other things. So, are you ready for this? It's called Implacable Mark, and it is by the Knight. Now, you tell me if you know what this ability does. Okay?
After you read it,
yeah.
If I can actually figure out what it does. Okay.
Are you ready? At 3rd level, you excel at foiling attacks and protecting your allies by menacing your foes. When you hit a creature with a melee weapon attack, the target is marked by you until the end of your next turn. Okay, that's not too bad. A creature ignores this effect if the creature can't be frightened. Okay, so caveat number 1. The marked target has disadvantage on any attack roll against a creature other than you or someone else who marked it. If a target marked by you is within 5 feet of you on its turn and it moves at least 1 foot or makes an attack that suffers disadvantage from this feature, you can make 1 melee weapon attack against it using your reaction. This attack roll has advantage, and if it hits, the attack's weapon deals extra damage to the target equal to your fighter level. You can make this special attack even if you have already expended your reaction for this round, but not if you have already used your reaction this turn. You can make this attack 3 times, and you regain all expended use of it when you finish a short or long rest. I have no idea what that really does.
And I am not interested in getting bogged down in what it does, but that's the thing, because I'm yeah.
I just want to say, whoever wrote that, I'm not trying to dunk on you. I've done the same kind of stuff, but I never forgot it.
Of course.
It's not their fault. It's not their fault. And you guys know that, but that's the interesting thing, right? Is Jeff, you mentioned it. They have to do this. Separate from the concept that
with the way that 5e is written, it has to be written like that. Yeah.
Exactly. But that's another interesting parallel to programming in the sense that it's the extensibility is low. It's hard to add something to 5th edition because of all the caveats you have.
Yes.
They didn't categorize things well enough to say works in these cases, does not work in these cases, right? There is a way to rewrite that rule, even outside of the system, even format it differently. But between the amount of caveats they have to put in and continuing to use the same format they used before for no reason other than that they did, and they're a big company, it's probably a hard thing to convince people to change. No, if you want to write that rule, Tim, it's not that hard to explain in 2 sentences. But if you want to write that rule in D&D, that guy, like you said, you're not dunking on him, but I'm like,
or girl.
That's how the editor approves that thing. Yeah. The marking of, you know what I mean? And I'm like, that is what you can avoid if you use behavior-driven development, because the inability to add things to your game later is something you need to avoid when you first start making it.
Yeah, it's just it's a perfect sort of summation of all the different layers the conversation is passed through of it's not elegant, it's not driven by player behavior, it's the language is bogged down and technical, it's needlessly dense for not an exciting result. It's and again, I'm totally with you of to put that ability in an official Wizards book for 5e, you have to write the ability like that, because if you don't, there's going to be players by the thousands who will be like, oh, well, you can technically then use it like this, and it gets around that, and it's just so in order to stop that, they have to write it like that. I wish they didn't, and I wish that they would have, structured their language and the spirit of the rules better earlier on, so that they didn't have to write abilities that sound like that. Because that I could figure out what they mean for that to do if I sat and really worked it out, but based on just listening to you say it, it sounds so insane.
And
yeah.
If we go back to what you did in Dragon Grin, Tim, if the first 2 sentences were, this ability is meant to do X, Y, and Z, this ability allows you to mark people and they can't hit you, then the very technical explanation of the rules, you're like, okay, I see what I'm doing, but now I can just check for the caveats instead of, wait, what? Because at no point does it make it clear.
Right, because they put a narrative line in there, but it's not clear to the intent of the rules. It could also be open interpretation. So I have an idea, and then I have a funny story to tell you to kind of wrap it up. So the idea that I have is, not now, but another time, I think maybe we should, put our belt on the line rather than just dunking on this. I think it could be a fun experiment to take that exact wording, and then in a Google Doc, the 3 of us do a design jam where we try to rewrite it cleaner, smoother, and I'm not even necessarily saying we follow the exact 5e syntax, but get close enough like we did for Dragon Grin, and just try to see the intent, and then, so basically, try to make that better. I haven't seen I don't even remember if there was a knight in Xanathar's Guide. I know the samurai's in there, so I don't know if that ever made the light of day, so I don't know if there is a real one, but if there is, I won't look it up.
Yeah. No, and that's fair. But I think you could do that with anywhere. If you take any ability that's written like that and try to write what the behavior is in the other way and get an idea of how that matches up, I think would just be really cool. To then go, okay, well, if we wanted to do that,
right?
I think that's great. So, but yeah.
That would be fun, I think. So, Jeff, would you be down for something like that?
Yeah, definitely.
All right, so you were talking about, and you made this very offhanded comment, James, about how if you look in the, what did you call it again? The design document?
Or the design document, yeah. If you look at your behaviors.
Yeah, so in the new Harbinger playtest that just came out a few days ago, I wrote this subsystem called drift carving. And it is essentially, you can hack your void ships to give it abilities, is kind of the whole concept. And so I tried to make it as simple as possible, as clean and as elegant as possible. And the idea being is, it gives the vessel the ability to act in a way during combat that would be superior to another one. So it sort of gives it like player abilities. So because of that, you can move twice, or you can shoot this or do these kinds of things. Well, in Harbinger, the system that is the economy for that sort of thing is Astrafade, right? So I write this whole system, all these abilities and all this other stuff, and I'm like, hey, cool. Let me just check the Astrafade section of the Void Ship rules and just make sure I have all the language right. And so it's the day that I have to have this done into Matt. And I go, hey, Matt, I thought ships had Astrafade. I'm looking in the doc. There is not. Ships do not have Astrafade. And so I go, oh no. It's basically either cut this whole section or Tim's going to write 5 Astrafade tables for ships. And I was like, I really love this little... So I had that exact thing happen, James. I wrote this and I was like, oh, cool. And I was even putting in like people on the ship also, the people who are piloting or gunning, they have roles, and those roles have specific actions to ship combat. I was making new ones that cost Astrafade, like shoot harder and all this. All that to say, we get down and I'm like, you know what? And I ended up just knocking out like 4 new Astrafade tables for ships.
That have Astrafade now, yeah.
That now have Astrafade. And so I waited to finish that before I told Matt. So I was like, hey, so he's like, well, yeah, we don't have Astrafade tables. And I was like, if you're cool with it, I did write the Astrafade tables. I wrote the Astrafade description for Void Ships. It just needs an edit pass. And he goes, oh, awesome. So I had that exact thing happen. I didn't check the technical document before I gave all these ships Astrafade. So hopefully this was helpful to you if you are writing and designing game rules. And if you have any questions about what we said, obviously we want to hear your opinions on all these things. But if you have a game design question, and that can be tricky because in game design you often need a lot of context. So less specific game design of X or Y and more general ones about tips or advice or how we handle scenarios or situations, drop them in the comments, and we can either address them in potentially a future video or try to respond. But we're Tabletop Terrors. We're all about fun, creativity, and RPGs. And if you like those kinds of things, consider subscribing, and we would love to have you as a part of the channel. As we often do, let's wrap things up with a Tabtarian toast.
May you mend the first break.
May you kill the first snake.
May you conquer everything you undertake.
Sludge.
Sludge.
So, Tim didn't end up doing it in his story, but just something I want to touch on when it comes to designing systems is it's so easy to forget sometimes of like, once you add something in, how many other things have to then be added around that for it to make any sense. It's like, okay, so we have Astrafade costs. That means we need Astrafade charts, and we need all these different systems. And it's like, even just this, as silly as it is, the example of James using like, if you have people who can hit people with swords, that means you need swords in your game. And that means that those rules have to be able to support swords and what they do and what they mean. So it's totally, I think it's tempting sometimes when you have that situation to like continue to build out as far as it goes, all these things that have to support this weird fringe idea that you have. Sometimes the best thing you can do for an idea like that is just to cut it. Just to say, it's not worth it. The game is like warped around this thing so much, where so much of this book has now become dedicated to supporting this thing that really doesn't matter. Just get rid of it. If it's not that important and you're dedicating all these resources to building it up, just cut it. It's okay to like let that darling die and go on your merry way, and your game will sometimes be much better for it.